Thank you for watching this video. All likes, comments and subscribes are greatly appreciated. This video is going to be briefly about the Battle of Lincoln fought in 1141. I won't go into too much detail about the reign of King Stephen, as I did that in my video on him. But here I'll focus on the battle itself. Stephen had usurped the throne in 1135 from the Empress Matilda, who had made her move to regain the throne in 1139. England was now at civil war. Lincoln had been captured by Ranulph, Earl of Chester. Ranulph was the son-in-law of the Empress Matilda's key supporter, her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester. So the move for him to snatch Lincoln was an act of loyalty towards Matilda and her claim to the throne. Stephen reacted swiftly to the news of the capture of Lincoln by heading north almost immediately, where he'd besiege the city of Lincoln. The siege itself lasted until early February 1141. Inside the city walls, Ranulph would have been getting increasingly desperate. Having the king's army outside would have been hugely unnerving for him. If Lincoln fell to the king, then Ranulph's neck was almost certainly going to be on the chopping block. So Ranulph, in response, requested urgent support from his father-in-law, Robert, who duly obliged. Along with his followers, Robert made straight for the king's army. In terms of size, Robert's forces were about the same as the king's. Robert didn't have the easiest journey north, however. He and his men almost became bogged down in a thick marsh, which Henry of Huntingdon describes as almost impassable. They eventually made it to Lincoln to relieve Ranulph and attempt to lift the siege of King Stephen. Robert's first move was to organise his men into 3 divisions. At the front were his own men. Behind them was a line of noblemen who had been left disinherited by Stephen and who now sought vengeance against the king and his deposition. At the rear, Robert had a full view of the battle, and from where he could dictate his army's tactics. Also in Robert's army was a group of fierce Welsh fighters. Robert's power base was in the southwest, an area, along with Wales, that had given Stephen serious problems earlier in his reign, and a region that would have provided the bulk of Robert's army now. Ranulph would have been extremely glad to see the arrival of Robert, and he addressed his allies with a speech prior to the battle. He addresses, according to Henry of Huntingdon, Robert as invincible leader and refers to Stephen as that treacherous king. Robert then himself gave a rousing speech to Ranulph and the army, and they were now very much ready for battle. In Stephen's camp there must have been tremendous trepidation. The king's crown was now very much on the line. The king took mass and no doubt prayed for his salvation and a successful conclusion to the battle. However, during the service, there was 2 ominous signs for Stephen. He was offering a candle to the bishop, which then proceeded to fall to pieces in his hands. On top of this, a pyx hanging from a chain, containing the image of Christ, fell to the ground. In the 12th century, signs such as these would have been a strong indication that disaster was imminent. Although these events seem innocuous now, Events such as these would have been greatly unsettling for Stephen. Despite the eventful mass, Stephen then took to the battlefield and, like Robert had done, drew up his armies into battle lines. Here it might have been expected for the king to give a powerful and inspiring speech, but due to Stephen's rather feeble speaking voice, the honour of this was given to a knight by the name of Baldwin. Once the speech had been given, and the roars of the fired-up armies rang through the air, battle commenced. The first part of Robert's army to throw themselves at the king's forces was the second line, the men who had been disinherited by King Stephen, and who were spurred on by the indignity of the perceived injustices that had been carried out against them. However, their eagerness to engage the king in battle didn't pay off, and they were quickly put to the sword. And then the Welsh part of Robert's army was attacked by two of Stephen's nobles, and they were scattered as well. So things initially looked good for the embattled king, but the tide began to turn when Ranulph began to beat back the men of William of Ypres, who was one of Stephen's allies. When William saw the king on foot and right in the midst of the battle, he came to the conclusion that he was on the losing side, and so he decided to flee the scene of the battle. The fighting grew steadily more and more fierce, and there was no more fierce blows being struck than by those of the king. Spotting Stephen, Ranulph charged at him, but was driven back by the ferocity of the king's defences. But the bravery of his fighting eventually proved to no avail. Stephen was eventually overwhelmed and captured. Though he had been defeated by Robert's forces, Stephen does come out of the battle with some credit. He had clearly shown he was a brave man, but he had left himself woefully exposed, not unlike Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. If he had positioned himself a bit more like Robert, at the rear of his army, then perhaps he would have escaped capture and been able to dictate the terms of the battle. But even though he was now into the 6th year of his reign, I think it's quite likely, as a usurping king, that Stephen still felt he had to demonstrate his right to rule, and that's why he threw himself into the midst of the battle. Whilst this can be considered commendable, he had ultimately paid the price, and he was now Matilda and Robert's prisoner. After the battle, he was taken to Bristol, where he was held until Robert himself was captured.